Now, Nigel Farage may have just made things a little bit easier for the Tories after announcing that the Brexit Party will not contest any of the 317 seats that were won by the Conservatives in the last general election. Well, it comes after one of Mr Farage's biggest former allies, Arron Banks, was reportedly set to advise voters to back Boris Johnson and not the Brexit Party. Well, joining me now to discuss all things politics from Westminster is the public affairs consultant and former advisor to David Cameron, Alex Dean, and also the chief executive of the New Economics Foundation and former advisor to Ed Miliband, Miatta Fahnbulleh. Good afternoon to both of you.
Hi, Samantha.
Alex, to you first. I mean, what do you make of this? Do you think Nigel Farage has blinked?
Oh, I think it's big news. I think it's probably the biggest single development in the election campaign so far. There's, of course, a lot of attention on the Tory-Labour marginals, which traditionally decide elections in the UK, smattering in the south, but mostly across the Midlands and in the northeast, northwest. This will have repercussions in those seats, but I'd highlight two other regions of the country where this is going to be significant. The first is the southwest, where the fight is really between the Conservative Party and the Liberal Democrats. This is bad news for the Lib Dems, because of course the southwest is Lib Demi but quite Brexity, and they were hoping to take back some of the seats that they've lost to the Tories from the coalition years, and a split between the Tories, who hold lots of seats in the southwest, a split between the Tories and the Brexit Party would have been good for the Lib Dems. So good for the Tories there, bad for the Lib Dems. And the other area is Scotland, where of course the Tories made some gains in what was otherwise a disappointing 2017 general election, and the SNP is undeniably doing well. Well, you've got fewer choices now if you're in a seat which has an incumbent Tory MP, but you favour Brexit, than you're in Scotland, and that therefore makes it a bit more, just that bit more likely that the Tories hang on to seats or lose fewer seats in Scotland in this election. So I think it's good news for the Tories in those two regions too.
Miatta, do you agree with Alex? Do you think this is the most significant thing that's happened so far in the election campaign?
Well, I think it will have an impact. And what I'd say is that, you know, in Labour Leave areas in particular, this will be a worrying development, I think, for the Labour Party. But I think it will depend on what the campaign is run on and fought on the ground. So Labour will be trying to make the campaign about anything but Brexit. They will be trying to make it about the fact that our public services are on their knees, about the NHS, about the squeeze in living standards that we're seeing. And I think if they can do that, then it's a much harder proposition for the Brexit Party, because yes, we know they stand for Brexit, but once we've left, once we've achieved Brexit, then what are they for? What will they change? How will they make the country better? And I don't think they have an answer to any of those things. So if Labour can take the debate onto those sort of issues, then I think the Brexit Party poses less of a threat than if it's simply on Brexit.
Yeah.
Come on, Alex, what do you say to that?
So I think there's a lot of fairness in that, especially in those seats which haven't been won by the Conservative Party in, say, over 100 years, but were Leave-leaning. The Labour Party's challenge there is somewhat from the Brexit Party, with people who would otherwise be Labour Party voters but might lend their votes to the Brexit Party. The challenge there in the context is that even in those seats, there's still plenty of people who voted Remain or want us to remain in the EU, and the split there is between the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats. Well, of course, the Labour Party's current position of having a renegotiation with the EU, getting a new deal, then having a second referendum on their new deal, and then campaigning against their own deal is not appealing to people who want us to remain. And those people are more likely to vote for the Lib Dems, who, whatever you think of their position, at least have clarity in their Brexit standpoint. So in those seats, the Brexit Party taking votes away from the Labour Party is significant, even if the Brexit Party don't win any of them, because they're making it more likely that in a perhaps real shifting environment, the Lib Dems are a challenger to the Labour Party in those seats, because even if it's just 40% of the voters who want to remain, the 40% as a unified bloc could be very significant.
Do you think we could see Nigel Farage retreat further? I mean, talking about the Labour Leave seats there, might he also withdraw from that if you're going to get all this splitting of the vote? I mean, Miatta, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think it was always a slightly, let's say, bonkers position for him to want to field 600-odd seats, because it spreads the resources of a small party quite thinly. And actually, it makes far more sense for them to kind of focus on a handful of seats where, if they do the maths, they might have a chance of kind of breaking through. But, you know, to the point about, you know, the Lib Dems and Labour being squeezed, I think that's absolutely right. Like, in, you know, their position, they would argue, is very clear, which is we want to negotiate a deal that won't tank the economy, and then we want to put it over to the British people to decide. That is a perfectly rational position, but when you've got a very strong Brexit position, either from the Conservatives or the Brexit Party, and a really strong Remain position from the Lib Dems, it does squeeze them. So I think the course of this election will be determined by the frame of the election. If it continues to be a Brexit election, then I think it becomes very, very difficult for the Labour Party. If they can shift it onto other issues, then I think they have a shot. And what's really interesting is if you take the first week of the campaign, it wasn't about Brexit. It was about the NHS, it was about the economic plan, investment in public services. It was about the issues that Labour wants to be talking about. And if they can sustain that, if they can keep the agenda on the issues, then I think it's still open.
How do you think Labour do that, Alex?
Well, they'll stick to their messaging points. And of course, modern elections tend not to be clashes between two opposing arguments, but modern elections look a bit more like tram lines, where I stick to my messages and you stick to yours, and we stay in our lanes, and we hope to convince more of the people who support our position to come out for us than the people who are convinced on the other side to come out for our opponents. But just a few words on your question about whether the Brexit Party should stand down against Labour leavers too. It's much less clear if you do that, because you're trying to single out individuals rather than taking a blanket position as it pertains to a party, which will have downsides for Nigel Farage, let us not forget, because in Labour-leaning areas, one of the big arguments was that he was a palatable alternative to the Tories. And now, as you've been reporting, and when he throws his hat into the ring or throws his support behind the Conservative Party, it may harm him in some of those seats which you thought, the Tories couldn't win, but maybe the Brexit Party could. If he's thinking about singling out individuals in the Labour Party who've been, in his view, solid on Brexit, some of them, I'm afraid, have left. Gisela Stewart was chairman of the Vote Leave campaign, not in Parliament now. Kate Hoey was very reliable for the Brexit cause on the Labour benches, not standing again in this election. So I think it's quite unlikely they'll single out some of the individual candidates from Labour, not least because some of the leading lights have gone.
Alex, something you were saying in one of your earlier answers was talking about the impact of what's just happened today, Nigel Farage's announcement, on how the Lib Dems need to position themselves. I mean, where does all of this leave the Remain alliance, and how strategically should they respond to what they've heard today?
Oh, they should keep going, and they should say, we've got our arrangements in place to try and keep us in the EU. Whatever one thinks of it, I happen to think it's profoundly undemocratic, but there are lots of people who support that view. So they should stick to their guns and keep making that argument, whilst portraying the Tory party as having been swallowed up by the Brexit Party, and the Tory party is now the Brexit Party, was Jo Swinson's response. I mean, I find that pretty farcical, given that Farage asked for a deal, didn't get one, and then took this position unilaterally. But there will be some people that will hear that and will listen to that message in the country. So even if one doesn't think it's logical, that should be the continued Lib Dem position.
Miatta, what do you think about that, about the Remain alliance? I mean, they had some success with their electoral pact and a by-election, but it's different on a national level, isn't it?
It is, and look, I think the big risk for the Remain side is that their vote is split, and so you end up having a majority Conservative government that will choose to interpret that as a mandate for a particular form of Brexit, when in fact that's not where the country is, but the Remain vote was split. So I think they have to maintain their alliance, and I think the really interesting question for them to work out is when they're going up against Labour, particularly where you have very pro-Remain Labour MP standing, what do they do? Because I think that's the real risk, where they split the vote and then you allow the Conservatives or indeed the Brexit Party to come through the middle. So I suspect what you'll see is on the ground some kind of manoeuvrings and positioning, but also I think Remain voters are going to be very tactical in this election, and I think a lot of them will be thinking the vote is split multiple ways. What's the best chance of me getting a candidate that's going to secure a second referendum? And so I think we'll see a lot of intelligent voting from the electorate as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I accept that, actually, Samantha. I think that's probably right. And I, as a Brexiteer, would look at that question environment, and I would think to myself, well, if we do get a Conservative majority, one could argue that it's a case that's been made for Boris's deal negotiated and agreed with the EU. But I think the strongest argument, and Miatta's just made it from the other side, from the Remain alliance point of view, the strongest argument you could make about the election we've just had, we get a Tory majority, is that it's a confident vote not to have a second referendum and now to see through the Brexit results. And I think that there'll be many in the country who'd regard that as a win.
All right, Alex Miatta Fahnbulleh, thank you very much for your time on Sky News.
Thanks, Samantha.
Thank you.